Evan Kincaid sat stiffly at the long, obsidian dining table, doing his best to keep his expression neutral as a room full of aliens roared with laughter. The grand chamber of the Galactic Culinary Exchange was packed with representatives from 12 different species, each seated in elaborately designed chairs suited to their physiology. The air hummed with overlapping conversations in multiple languages, though right now most of them were just mocking him. The walls shimmered with holographic projections of interstellar delicacies, fermented plankton from Eulora Prime, crystallized protein spheres from the Atron Belt, and the infamous Gorlak stew from the warlike Stranaxians. That last dish was infamous. Apparently it had to be eaten with protective gloves if you wanted to keep your fingers intact. A massive Dranaxian general, Korash, leaned forward, his 6 black eyes gleaming with amusement. His armor barely fit the ceremonial robe draped over it, and his forearms rested heavily on the table. Humans, always claiming resilience. And yet I have heard your digestive systems are fragile, weak, incapable of handling real food. Evan met his gaze, careful not to show any reaction. This was not his first time being underestimated. One of the smaller delegates, a Zeltharian with bioluminescent tendrils, let out a sharp chittering noise. Their cuisine is balanced. What does that even mean? True food is not balanced, it is an experience that reshapes you, humbles you, burns its mark into your very being. Evan exhaled slowly. He had been sent to this diplomatic event to represent Earth, to bridge cultural gaps and foster understanding between species. But right now it was feeling less like a diplomatic dinner and more like a schoolyard challenge. Look, he said, keeping his tone even. Our food isn't weak. It's diverse, complex, and yes, balanced. You can have something mild, something sweet, something spicy. It's about enjoying the flavors, not just enduring pain. Korash let out a deep, guttural chuckle. Pain is part of the experience, human. Only the strongest survive it. Evan tilted his head. You talk like your food is a battlefield. The Dranaxian grinned, revealing serrated teeth. It is. And now we will test you. With a gesture, Korash signaled to one of the servers, a thin, pale creature from some neutral species. The server hesitated before bringing forth a massive stone bowl filled with dark, bubbling sludge. The moment it was set on the table, the air around it shimmered as if distorted by heat. A pungent, acrid scent filled the room, something between burnt metal and rotting fruit. Evan's stomach clenched, but he didn't let it show. He glanced at the Seraphian diplomat beside him, a delicate-looking figure with translucent wings. The Seraphian leaned in and whispered, it once melted through a serving tray. The laughter in the room grew. Korash bared his teeth. This is Gorlak's stew, the pride of Dranaxian warriors. We grow up on it. Only the strongest stomachs survive it. Evan stared at the steaming bowl. What's in it? Korash shrugged. Meat, spices. A few. Unique ingredients. Evan arched an eyebrow. Like what? The general grinned. The blood of the Gorlak beast, which thickens when exposed to oxygen. The roots of the Jorvan fire plant, which ignites when chewed. And a blend of Dranaxian warrior spices, which if improperly prepared, can cause temporary blindness. The Zeltharian beside him clicked his mandibles. Eat, human. Show us your balance. Evan picked up the heavy stone spoon resting beside the bowl. The stew's surface shifted slightly, as though it was still alive. He ignored the way the spoon's edges started corroding and scooped up a portion. The moment the thick, tar-like substance hit his tongue, his body went to war with itself. His brain screamed. His stomach lurched. His throat burned as if he had swallowed molten iron. His vision blurred. His ears rang. His hands gripped the table as his body instinctively tried to reject what he had just consumed. He forced himself to swallow. The room fell silent. Evan placed the spoon down carefully. He exhaled slowly, forcing his muscles to relax. His eyes were watering, his lips tingling, and there was a distinct possibility that he had just scorched a hole through part of his esophagus. But he kept his expression neutral. He turned to Korash and nodded. Not bad. The silence deepened. The Zeltharian's tendrils dimmed to a pale blue. Impossible. Korash leaned in, his grin faltering. You should be writhing in pain, begging for mercy. Evan wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. I've had worse. The Dranaxian's eyes narrowed. His pride had been challenged, and there was only one way forward. Then you must return the challenge. Evan's brow furrowed. What? Korash gestured toward the servers. If you endure Dranaxian food, we will endure human food. This is the way of the warrior. You prove your strength by making us suffer as you have suffer. Evan considered this. All right, but no complaints when you realize what you signed up for. The laughter returned, but this time it was confident. They were humoring him. The idea that human food could match theirs was ridiculous to them. Evan allowed himself a small smirk. They had no idea what was coming. Evan stood outside a small, unassuming restaurant on the human diplomatic station, checking the neon sign overhead. The glowing letters read Sathira's authentic Thai cuisine. It was one of the few human-run eateries allowed within the Galactic Embassy District, and more importantly, it was one of the only places in the sector that made food hot enough to make his Dranaxian friends regret their choices. The aliens stood behind him, looking unimpressed. Korash folded two of his arms over his massive chest, the plates of his armor clinking softly. This is where the humans intend to match Dranaxian fire. He let out a derisive chuckle. It looks fragile. Evan smirked. Oh, it looks harmless? But trust me, you're about to experience something special. The door slid open as they entered, and a small, elderly Thai woman looked up from behind the counter. She was barely 5 feet tall, her gray-streaked hair tied back in a bun. Her eyes landed on Evan, then on the massive aliens behind him, and she exhaled through her nose, unimpressed. You bring big men here before, she said, adjusting her apron. Last time they cry. Evan grinned. Different big men this time. They think our food is weak. Sathira's eyes narrowed, and she turned her gaze toward Korash. The Dranaxian general was busy inspecting a menu on the wall, scoffing at the images of what, to him, were delicate human meals. Weak, she repeated. Pathetic, Korash confirmed. Sathira nodded to herself, walked to the kitchen window, and called out a few sharp commands in Thai. A series of rapid, deliberate movements followed as her cook sprang into action. The sound of wok sizzling filled the air, accompanied by the fragrant scent of chili, garlic, and lemongrass. The Dranaxian warriors didn't even flinch. I am not afraid of sense, Korash muttered. Evan pulled out a chair and sat down. You will be. Within minutes, steaming plates of food were placed in front of them. Bowls of tom yum soup, their surfaces shimmering with chili oil. Plates of som-tam salad, bright and fresh, yet laced with the unmistakable fire of bird's-eye chilies. Then came the main event, a massive plate of pad ki mao, or drunken noodles, practically glowing with spice. Sathira didn't ask what heat level they wanted. She simply cooked it the way it was meant to be. The aliens stared at the food. Korash picked up his fork and stabbed at the noodles, lifting them cautiously. They glistened with sauce, flecks of crushed red chili coating every strand. Evan watched, waiting. Korash took a bite. At first, nothing. He chewed. The flavors rolled over his tongue, complex and layered. A hint of sweetness, the umami depth of soy sauce, the fragrant basil. Then the heat began to rise. Korash's chewing slowed. The other Dranaxians dug in, confident in their invincibility. Then the first cough came. One of Korash's officers, a large brute named Vornik, cleared his throat and took a deep breath. Korash swallowed, eyes narrowing. He took another bite, stubborn. The spice hit in waves, the slow burn of dried chilies, the sharp sting of fresh ones, the relentless, creeping fire that did not fade but grew. A bead of sweat formed on Korash's brow. His 4 nostrils flared. Evan took a casual sip of his iced tea. Everything all right. Korash's hands tensed around his utensils. This is different. One of the lesser Dranaxians let out a strangled noise. His eyes were watering. He gritted his teeth, trying to breathe through the pain. It burns. It's supposed to burn, Evan said, twirling his own fork through the noodles. You wanted to experience human food, right? Well, this is what spice is about. It's not just pain, it's flavor. It enhances everything. That heat you're feeling? It's activating your whole palate. Korash exhaled sharply. His skin had taken on a darker hue, his body struggling to process the unfamiliar heat. He picked up a glass of water and drank deeply. Evan winced. Too late. The moment the water hit, the burn exploded. The oils from the chilies spread across his tongue like wildfire. Korash slammed the glass down, gripping the table. Evan leaned back. You probably shouldn't have done that. The Dranaxian general's 6 eyes widened. He let out a short, choked growl and reached for a piece of naan bread from a nearby basket, shoving it into his mouth in desperation. It helped a little. The Zeltharian delegate was no better off. His bioluminescence flickered erratically as he coughed into his hands. This is unnatural. Evan picked up a spoon and calmly took a bite of his tom yum soup. The sour tang of lime balanced perfectly against the heat of the broth. He sighed in satisfaction. You know, he said, we haven't even gotten to the really spicy stuff. The room fell into stunned silence. Korash, still breathing heavily, turned his gaze toward Evan. There is worse than this. Evan set his spoon down. Much worse. Korash's pride fought against the reality of his suffering. He forced himself to straighten, still sweating. Humans are insane. Evan smiled. And you haven't even tried the fresh chili sauce yet. Cythera, who had been watching in amusement, silently placed a small dish on the table. A bright red paste, shimmering with seeds and oil, sat before them. The Dranaxians looked at it with something approaching fear. Evan dipped his spoon into the sauce and drizzled a small amount over his noodles. So he said, glancing up at Korash, "Still think human food is weak?" Korash did not answer immediately. He was busy trying to discreetly wipe his running nose. Evan leaned back, crossing his arms. He already knew the answer. Korash was not about to admit defeat. The Dranaxians were a warrior race, forged in the fires of battle and hardship. They had conquered planets, crushed rebellions, and endured the harshest environments in the known galaxy. And yet, this plate of human food was proving to be one of their greatest challenges. The spice had settled in now, not a sharp, fleeting pain, but a deep, simmering burn that refused to fade. It clawed at the back of Korash's throat, crept up into his sinuses, and wrapped itself around his entire being like a vice. His stomach felt like it was processing molten rock. And worse, Evan Kincaid was enjoying himself. The human diplomat sat calmly, savoring his meal like nothing was wrong, like they weren't experiencing what could only be described as a culinary death march. He didn't mock them outright, but the smug glint in his eyes was undeniable. Korash couldn't let this stand. He reached for the small dish of chili paste Cythera had placed before them. The moment his fingers wrapped around the spoon, Evan gave a quiet chuckle and shook his head. You really don't have to do that. Korash bristled. Are you saying I cannot handle it? Evan sighed, setting his utensils down. I'm saying you definitely can't handle it. Korash gritted his teeth and dipped the spoon into the fiery red paste, scooping out a generous portion. His warriors tensed as they watched. The Zeltharian delegate had fully abandoned his meal and was now fanning his own mouth, his bioluminescence flickering wildly. Korash stared at the sauce. It looked like blood. Thick, glistening, alive. The scent rising from it was not just heat but danger. He had smelled plasma fires that were less threatening. Still, he was Dranaxian. He did not retreat. He dumped the entire spoonful into his mouth. The effect was immediate. There was no gradual build-up, no slow climb into suffering. The heat detonated like a starship reactor breach, ripping through his throat and sending shock waves across every nerve ending in his body. His vision blurred, his exoskeletal plates tingled, and for the first time in his long and brutal life, he felt fear. His breathing quickened. His body temperature skyrocketed. The burn was no longer just in his mouth, it had reached his very soul. He gripped the table hard enough to leave dents in the surface. His vision swam. He could hear the blood rushing in his ears. Evan just took another bite of his noodles. "You good?" he asked. Korash could not speak. He could barely think. One of his subordinates, Vornek, watched in horror. "General." Korash's throat convulsed. He needed relief. His hands scrambled for something, anything that could save him. He grabbed the closest object and upended it into his mouth. A mistake. It was not water. It was pickle brine. The intense saltiness combined with the fire already consuming him, turning his suffering into something transcendent. His body tried to scream but had no voice left to do so. Evan winced. Oh man, that was a bad call. Korash's claws dug into the table. His breath came in ragged, uneven gasps. His warriors looked on, their expressions a mixture of horror and reverence. One of them whispered, "The general has ascended." Sathira, ever the professional, simply folded her arms and nodded. Yes, this happens sometimes. Korash's vision swam. He had faced death before, but never in such an insidious form. The battlefield at least gave him an enemy he could see, an opponent he could strike down. But this was a ghost of fire that could not be fought, only endured. He realized, with growing horror, that the burn was still getting worse. His hands twitched, his heart pounded. And then, his body betrayed him. A single tear rolled down his cheek. The entire table gasped. Evan exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. Yup, there it is. Korash's breathing had become ragged, uneven. He slammed a fist against his chest, as if trying to physically force his body back into submission. Evan casually picked up a glass of coconut milk and pushed it toward him. "This will help." Korash eyed it suspiciously, but at this point his pride had been reduced to ashes. He snatched the glass and drained it in one gulp. Instant relief. The fire did not vanish, but the intensity dulled, shifting from imminent death to mere agony. He exhaled, gripping the table as his body recalibrated. Evan leaned back. So he gestured toward the plate. "Still think human food is weak?" Korash did not answer immediately. He was busy trying to discreetly wipe the single tear from his face. One of his warriors, still fanning his own mouth, croaked out, "We have underestimated you." The Zeltharian delegate, who had been quietly chugging a bottle of water to no avail, gasped, "You humans choose this suffering." Evan grinned. "We don't just choose it, we love it." Korash exhaled, his composure barely returning. He locked eyes with Evan, his respect for the human shifting into something deeper. "You," Korash said slowly, "are dangerous." Evan chuckled, twirling his fork through the remaining noodles. "Told you." Korash sat in stunned silence, his body still recovering from the devastation that was Thai spice. His warriors were no better off. Vornek had abandoned his meal entirely, slumped in his chair, breathing heavily. The Zeltharian delegate had resorted to dunking his entire face in a bowl of ice water, his bioluminescent tendrils flickering in distress. Evan, on the other hand, was calmly finishing his plate of drunken noodles, as if he hadn't just watched several proud warriors nearly be destroyed by a handful of chilies. He pushed his empty bowl aside and took a long sip of his iced tea, relishing the moment. Sathira, ever the professional, cleared the dishes with the practiced efficiency of someone who had seen this exact scenario play out before. She did not gloat, did not rub it in, she simply existed as a silent, unshakable force of nature, the true master of spice in this establishment. Korash finally found his voice, though it was hoarse. "This is a weapon." Evan grinned. "No, it's just dinner." Korash gave him a slow, wary look. "You willingly consume this." "All the time," Evan said. "In fact, some people like it hotter." The table collectively tensed. Even the Seraphian diplomat, who had wisely refrained from participating in the challenge, let out a disbelieving whisper. "There is hotter." Evan shrugged. "Sure, this was just a normal spice level. We have ghost peppers, pepper X, Carolina Reapers, Naga Viper's chili's so strong they can make a fully grown man question his life choices. He gestured toward Korash. I mean, you saw what just happened. And this was mild compared to those. Korash stared at him, horrified. You breed these things to be stronger. Evan grinned. Of course. It's called selective cultivation. The silence stretched. Then Vornek, still breathing through his mouth, muttered, humans are insane. The Zeltharian groaned. I am still burning. Korash rubbed a hand down his face, exhaling. We came here believing humans to be fragile. Weak, his gaze flicked towards Cythera, who stood by the kitchen with her arms crossed, watching them with a knowing expression. But now, I see the truth. Evan leaned forward. And what's that? Korash's 6 eyes locked onto him. You are not weak. You are creatures of suffering. You seek pain and embrace it. You cultivate fire and call it cuisine. You ingest what should be poison and make it a delicacy. He inhaled deeply. You are terrifying. Evan smirked. And yet, here you are, still alive. Barely, Vornek muttered. Korash sat back, still shaken but processing everything. He had come into this challenge expecting human food to be a joke, a pale imitation of the legendary Dranaxian cuisine. But what he had experienced was something different. Dranaxian food was brutal, yes, but it was predictable. A test of endurance, nothing more. This had been calculated warfare. The spice had snuck up on him, pretending to be harmless at first. It had built up in layers, attacking different parts of his body in waves. It had lingered, refusing to fade even now. Every sip of water had made it worse. Every attempt to fight back had only deepened his suffering. Humans didn't just eat spice. They weaponized it. Evan casually cracked his knuckles. So, still think Dranaxian cuisine is the strongest in the galaxy. Korash stared at his empty plate. His body still ached. His pride had taken a hit. But he was not a fool. Slowly he shook his head. No, he met Evan's gaze. It is clear now. Humans are the undisputed masters of pain. Evan smiled. Glad we understand each other. Cythera walked over then, setting a small plate in front of Korash. The Dranaxian general looked down and froze. It was a single red chili. Take, Cythera said simply. For memory. Korash swallowed hard but picked up the tiny, unassuming pepper, holding it between his fingers like it was an ancient relic of unspeakable power. Evan gave him a knowing look. Careful with that. It's a Thai chili. Pretty strong. Korash held it carefully, as though afraid it would activate on contact. Then, with great respect, he tucked it into a secure pouch on his belt. A reminder. A warning. Evan stood, stretching. Well, I think that settles things. He clapped Korash on the shoulder, causing the massive warrior to tense involuntarily. Next time you visit Earth, we'll introduce you to real spice. Korash did not respond immediately. He was still processing his first experience. But after a long moment, he exhaled and nodded solemnly. You have my respect, human. Evan grinned. And you have mine. Just. Maybe start small next time, yeah? Korash, still reeling, nodded again. Vornek whispered, I am never eating again. Evan laughed. We'll see about that. As they left the restaurant, Korash glanced down at the chili in his hand, then back at Evan. And for the first time in his life, the great Dranaxian general was afraid of food.